to discuss these really important intersections. Thank you, Professor.
Great. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint. One sec. There we go. People can see this, right? Yeah. So I'm Sofya Aptekar. I am an associate professor of urban studies at the City University of New York School of Labor and Urban Studies, which is located on traditional and unceded territory of the Lenape people, otherwise known today as New York City. And I am going to talk a little bit about undocumented immigration, just a quick overview, before giving you some findings from a research project that I'm conducting with my CUNY colleagues that is focused on undocumented youth in New York City, who are quite a racially diverse group, and kind of provide an opportunity to think about issues of race and racism as they pertain to the immigration system. So to start, undocumented immigration is created by US policies that classify whole categories of people into the undocumented status, into illegality. And the way that it works currently is through two major pathways. People who enter the United States without inspection, whether they cross the border or they used documents that weren't, like supposedly fraudulent documents, or people who do come in as visitors on a variety of visas, and when their visas expire, they don't return, they don't leave the United States. So those are the two major ways that someone can become undocumented in the current US immigration system. So out of all immigrants in the US today, about a quarter are undocumented, or roughly 11 million. So you may have seen the hashtag all 11 million, referring to the call to for status to all undocumented immigrants and not select groups. A large portion of these immigrants are minors, are youths. And our research that I will be talking about today is part of a robust literature that explores the experiences of undocumented youth, many of whom grow up in the United States, right, and so face particular types of challenges.
Professor Aptekar, we just had a clarifying question. So is this categories something that's specific to the US immigration policy, or do other countries create similar categories?
That's a great question. Certainly it is not unique to the United States. Perhaps the scope might be unique, right? This is not an uncommon thing in terms of the way that global capitalism and settler colonialism operates, right? The creation of whole categories of people with very tenuous and uncertain legal status in order to extract, compliant and cheap labor from them. And in a lot of situations, the United States, including immigrants, come from places where the militaries or the multinational companies had been in order to disrupt their communities and make it unsafe or difficult to live, pushing people to migrate to rich countries. So I hope that answers some of the question.
Thank you.
Right, so I wanted to show you this chart to make a point that I'll be repeating a few times in this talk, and that is the diversity in terms of origins of the undocumented population in the United States that belies a lot of the stereotypes, including the stereotypes that undocumented youth themselves have about who is undocumented in the United States. So a lot of undocumented immigrants, and increasingly in recent years, come from Asia, the Caribbean, Europe and Canada, Middle East and Africa. And only about half at this present moment come from Mexico, even though the stereotype is often that undocumented immigration is a problem so-called problem of Mexican migration specifically. And since this is a talk that is at least partly about DACA, want to touch base with what DACA is for anyone who wants a reminder. It stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. It was an executive action that was a result of really fierce organizing by directly affected people that took place in 2012. It provided a reprieve from deportation and a renewable temporary work permit. So it was not a path to citizenship. It was just a matter of a 2-year renewable work permit. And since 2017, no new applications are accepted, only renewals. And the latest development of the renewals are only for a year, not 2 years. I'm not going to read through all the bullet points on the right, because that is just to give you a sense of all the criteria that someone needs to meet in order to get DACA. It is a lot, right? It is a program that was quite circumscribed in terms of who could qualify for it. And as a result, not all undocumented youth have DACA, even though, especially in the higher ed context, we hear the term DACA students used kind of as a catch-all term to capture the entire undocumented student population. It's really not accurate, because many college students who are undocumented today don't have DACA, and some of them have qualified for it and don't have it, but others don't qualify. So many that might be too old to have qualified under the provisions, they entered under the, after the window that was specified in terms of years, or they arrived when they were too old. And of course, because there are no new applications accepted, there's a growing post-DACA generation. So in my research, we did interview people who didn't have DACA. And some of what we heard from them is things like this quote from Kia, who is an immigrant from Botswana. And she is reflecting on her experiences as a college student at the City University of New York. She just said all they would do, this is her college, is advertise something about DACA. And if you know you don't even qualify for it, it's not like you're gonna go, but maybe they could have said something else. I don't know what, but something that would make me want to attend one of those events for such students. And so Kia went through, at that point, 3 years of college without ever having attended, which were kind of plentiful information sessions, legal assistance sessions, counseling sessions that were marketed to DACA students. And that would have probably helped her as well, but she was not a DACA student. So I just want to flag that concern that came up in our research that reflects the kind of conflation that sometimes happens, undocumented youth and DACA. And even when we were interviewing a few years ago, there was already kind of an emergent post-DACA generation. So Joseph, who's an immigrant from Indonesia, reflected on what it was like for him to not have DACA in the environments where DACA was so emphasized. So he said, when I was in high school, it was in high school when I found out I'm not eligible for it for DACA, which is like, so close. So he arrived just a little bit past the age. And I'm sure, I think you've spoken to a lot of DACA recipients, but coming from a non-DACA perspective, it's weird because within this immigrant community, you have division of DACA, which is a lot closer to that path to citizenship. It's not existent, let's be clear, but it's closer. You can work, you can drive, and then you have this lower tier where you just exist. You get a few opportunities if you're lucky and if you actively look for it. Over the years, that feeling has just grown, especially nowadays with the immigration debate. The focus seems to be on DACA recipients, which I get, of course. They should be really the center of conversation just because they got this work permit and it was taken away from them. Oftentimes within the immigrant community, only that part of the group is being discussed and addressed, whereas 10 million other immigrants are just left in limbo. It's been a disheartening experience lately. So keeping that in mind, that was my intro. And for the rest of my presentation, I'll give you a bit of context about New York City, where our research took place, specifics about our research project, which we call the Project on Immigration Higher Education. And I pulled out a few findings and quotes from our respondents that I hope will generate a discussion with this group about the ways that race and racism shape experiences of undocumented youth. And I'm really eager to hear your thoughts and how things might be different in California or any questions that you might have. So let me tell you a bit about New York. New York actually has the largest undocumented immigrant population, according to estimates, in the United States, so more than Los Angeles, and there are about 30,000 DACA recipients. We consider it to be a moderately favorable context of reception for undocumented immigrants. It's a mixed bag. New York is a mixed bag. So it didn't have driver's licenses until last year, and it didn't have any state financial aid for students until last year, although it did have in-state college tuition. And depending on where you are in New York State, the situation with policing and its ties with ICE is variable. So in much of upstate New York and in Long Island, it's a very hostile situation for immigrants with police cooperating with ICE. In New York City, it's also not great. There's many ways that immigrants, particularly immigrants of color, can be swept into the detention and deportation machinery. And there are ICE raids in New York City. So it is, it's a mixed bag. In terms of where undocumented New Yorkers come from, here are some numbers. So only about a third come from Mexico and Central America. This is different compared to the rest of the United States and in many places in California. And a lot of folks come from the Caribbean, from Africa and Asia, and a lot from South America as well. So I'm mostly drawing on this research project that I'm conducting with Professors Amy Sin and Holly Reed, who are my colleagues at Queens College, one of the colleges in the CUNY system. And what we did is we interviewed current or former CUNY students who either were undocumented at the time that we talked to them or had adjusted their status somehow, but when they first enrolled in college were undocumented. And these interviews took place in 2017, 2018. And because of the timing of the election, if anyone's interested in the Q&A, I can share how that shaped our methodology, because we had to make some very drastic changes all of a sudden. And we recruited primarily by flyering, a lot of flyering of all the different CUNY campuses. And unlike a lot of the existing literature on undocumented youth, our study ended up, we didn't really expect this. We ended up talking to a lot of youth who are not activists. And not only that, but often do not disclose their immigration status in school or even to friends. And some of them only said that they decided their family, like this was the first time they disclosed their status, was in interviews with us. So we didn't expect this to happen, but it provided an opportunity to see how youth who don't disclose status or participate in activism experience being undocumented. We also interviewed some college staff that work with immigrant students to get their perspective. And the whole research project was funded by the WT Grant Foundation. The City University of New York, or CUNY for short, is the largest urban public university system in the United States. We have more than 250,000 students. And we have more than 20 campuses across New York City. So it's an enormous system. It is is a public system and is incredibly defunded and experiencing extreme levels of austerity, which affect both the faculty and the students. And so that's the context in which we conducted our research. So there's one thing that's unique about CUNY, aside it's the largest public urban system, when it comes to undocumented immigrants. And that is that the CUNY administration actually keeps track of who's undocumented. So I want to explain to you how it does that. In order to get in-state tuition rates, which are significantly lower, students who are undocumented have to fill out an affidavit that states that if a path to citizenship were to become available to them, they will pursue it. And that is how they get in-state tuition. The take-up of this is very high because, especially without financial aid available, paying out-of-state tuition for a typical undocumented student just makes school undoable. And so the system is able to identify or estimate who's undocumented in this way, which raises several ethical issues and safety issues about data, right? That I hope that you're thinking of. But nevertheless, allows us to know the way that I think no other university system is able to, who our undocumented students are and where they come from. So in the first column are regions of birth. And what you will notice that is, in terms of CUNY undocumented students, a pretty diverse group, right? You know, roughly a third from Latin America, a quarter from Asia, and almost a third from the Caribbean. And in our study, so the PIHE is our study. I included the percentages there because we can actually compare to the underlying population of people at CUNY. So we have more, for example, students that we spoke to who are from Latin America than from the Caribbean. We interviewed people who overstayed visas and people who entered without inspection, and there were some interesting differences between those groups. A lot of people were DACA recipients, but not all. Some did not have DACA, and others were able to adjust their status. So by the time we spoke to them, they were legal permanent residents. And the first point I want to make, that's like just a really basic point that came out from our data, is that region of birth does not tell you that much about people's race. And so we asked people how they identify, and it's not, there's not that much correspondence because migration streams, global migration streams are quite complex, and there's diasporic populations across the world, and people migrate in stages and over generations. So we interviewed a lot of Asian undocumented students who were born and grew up in Latin America. We interviewed some Caribbean student who grew up in Japan. It got really complicated in terms of, and I show this because I think this complexity can get lost in some data analysis where we kind of use the region of birth as a proxy for a person's race. But very quickly we saw that in our data, we have to be very careful in terms of how it actually works. So I want to just mention that the MENA category stands for Middle Eastern North American. And we had a number of respondents who identified as such. So this complexity and diversity of the CUNY population was something that was not obvious to students themselves. And as well as the stereotypes about who is undocumented, we saw played a pretty powerful role in how people imagined who is undocumented, how they fit in. So here's Allison from Honduras is describing what happened when she went to the orientation for her scholarship. Her scholarship was specifically for undocumented students. So she says, something I didn't realize when I had my orientation, when I did get my scholarship, I walked in and then it was funny for me because I saw white people and I was shocked because I didn't think anyone who was white could be undocumented. I always thought people who were undocumented were Latinos. Right? Now she describes how the introductions went and how it made her realize that how the media portrays people who are undocumented. It's always portrayed to people who are Mexicans, and I feel like it's normal for me to think that. And then it makes me think about those who still have the same mentality where it's they only think it's Latinos who are undocumented. So in that college experience, the student had this realization of kind of the complexity and diversity of the undocumented population in New York. And so this shapes how people grow up and how they kind of think about themselves and how they access services on campus or imagine their careers. So folks like Madeline, who was from El Salvador, grew up where people were assuming she was Mexican, getting teased and being called illegal. And even, she experienced some of that even from her friends. So she had a very early awareness of her immigration status. And there was also, she was not able to deflect it or to really, that was the assumption that with which people were operating when interacting with her. Contrast that with Catalina, who is also a Latina, but from Chile. And she explained to us at length that she was white passing. And as a white passing person, she blended in. No one knew her status. And she was never questioned. And she told us that she knew that it was a big privilege. My parents, the same thing, we've never really been questioned. Yes, simple enough. So she was able to pass, right? And not experience this conflation of immigration status with race like Madeline did. And then we have Joseph, whose quote I already included earlier, explaining, we asked them about being Asian and undocumented, and he said, you've seen the rhetoric or the images of these undocumented people. Well, it's so wrong to say this, but they come from Mexico and they don't speak English. They just work these jobs, low-skilled jobs. Being able to speak the language and having friends, diverse groups of friends, hide the fact that I am undocumented. Joseph was quite strategic in who he socialized with. And as a relatively new immigrant, he also really focused on speaking a certain type of English as ways to cover up being undocumented. But of course, as an Asian person, that was far more available to him than it was for someone like Madeline. And let me talk a little bit more about why we would care about this. What difference would it make? So for people whose racialization involved assumptions of illegality, often had a more gradual realization of what undocumented meant. And by this, I mean people like Madeline, because of the way others interacted with them and the way they were racialized, they didn't learn about being undocumented when they applied for college and understood that there was no financial aid. They knew it from a much younger age. Whereas those who, for example, a lot of our Asian respondents didn't really have to grapple with this until junior, senior year of high school, which precipitated in a lot of them a huge crisis. Once they understood exactly how limited their futures might be. It also shaped awareness of immigration as a collective problem, right? So the flip side of being racialized as undocumented and having kind of an assumption made about you based on your race that you might be undocumented is a sense of this being a collective issue and something that you might fight collectively. And this can shape the way people got involved in organizing activism, not just because they realized that this was like a collective problem in their community. That definitely played a role. but also they often were able to have more of a structural analysis about how things worked rather than understanding this as a unique problem that their family faced. And it also shaped access to resources, right? So someone like Madeline, who was bullied in high school and called names, she actually was able to access more stuff, more help in college. Counterintuitively, that someone who had not realized their status, did not fully understand it, and then was hiding it. So people who were able to pass hid it more, and they didn't go to meetings and they didn't tell their advisors about their status for super valid reasons, right? But as a result, they often didn't find out very crucial things. So some of the examples, and this is relevant across the United States. In a lot of states, some of the jobs, the professions you might pursue require you to be a citizen or a legal permanent resident. And so when you go to college, you might be on that career track, but no one tells you, and it's the fault of the colleges, that you actually required to be a legal permanent resident or a citizen in order to have that job. So you might spend several years going to college on that track, and then people, some people dropped out of college once they understood that they could not actually do that profession. And then one more point is that staff and faculty, because we did interviews with staff and faculty as well, have their own ideas about who's undocumented and what undocumented students look like, right? And is often not accurate. It is often based on who comes to them and who discloses their status. And so you have kind of a feedback loop where the staff and faculty think that it's mostly Latinx students. They tailor the programming and the support to that student population, and that's who comes, and then it reinforces their understanding of who's undocumented on their campus. Specifically, because we had a lot of Asian respondents, I want to say that the Asian respondents from Latin America had a mix of experience. So because the way they were racialized, they could often pass as documented, but also some of them did not have access to resources, despite, for a lot of them, Spanish was a fluent language. And so some of the Spanish language advertising and so on, they could understand. But if their co-ethnic networks for their families and their communities were other Asian populations in New York, they did not necessarily get kind of tapped into the activism and the organizing and the support they might have otherwise. Which brings me to a point about the organizational landscape in New York City. So very curious to hear how it works for you all, but in New York City, Latinx, Korean, and South Asian community organizations are quite active around undocumented issues, including providing services for like DACA applications and renewals and advocacy. And they support a lot of organizing and advocacy efforts in the city. So I included pictures from Minkwon Center, which is a Korean organization, and Desi's Rising Up a Moving Drum, which is a South Asian organization. But the Chinese community organizations in New York City are far more focused on helping people with asylum cases, individual asylum cases, rather than having more collective organizing around undocumented issues, or even helping people with DACA applications. In fact, the uptake of DACA among Chinese undocumented youth is almost zero, almost no one. And there is far less collective mobilization in the city, in the Chinese community, around issues of being undocumented. So give you a couple examples of how this plays out on campus. So some non-Latinx youth perceive activist spaces and services on campus to be for Latinx youth. this is not because, often it's not because of the intent of the organizers, and actually oftentimes they're wrong. A lot of these spaces are not just Latinx, they include a lot of Asian and sometimes white and quite often Black student leaders, and the leadership of these organizations is quite diverse. But it's just the way the power of these racial stereotypes pervades how people think about it is pretty amazing. So Magdu, who was born in Bahrain, which does not give citizenship to immigrants, so she was an Indian citizen through her parents, went to a Dream Team club meeting at her college. And she said most of the people there were Hispanic, and they were very nice to her, but they were joking to each other in Spanish, and she felt like she didn't fit in. And it kind of tapped into her stereotypes about DACA people, as she called them, being Hispanic or Spanish. And she herself explained that it's because what you see on TV. Nevertheless, she did not go again, right? And then Julia, who was born in Germany to parents who were Turkish and Iranian, also we asked her about going to events or participating in clubs for undocumented youth, and she said that she knew that such things existed, but she did not attend or participate. She went to an event that was organized by her college for undocumented students, actually following the election. And she said it was tailored to exactly what Trump was talking about. So Latino migrants and people. And I understand they're a big part of the undocumented community, but they do cut out all the rest that are not of that ethnicity. And so there's just another one that didn't go again. And another crucial way that race and racism operated in the undocumented youth population that we spoke to was through the criminalization of Black and Latinx, particularly darker skinned Latinx respondents, male respondents. So there were so many stories that were about being stopped or arrested for jumping a turnstile on the subway. That was like a really common story, unfortunately. A lot of policing is concentrating on transit, right, in New York City. So John explained that from the day that he and his mom came to Trinidad, his mom said, be on your best behavior. Not only are you a young Black male, but you're also an illegal immigrant. Just as much as you're getting looked at and getting checked out all the time, if you ever do get caught, you're going to be sent out of the country. You're going to be deported. So in our interviews with these men, they often told, stories of how they navigated public spaces and how they were careful about and tried to deal with just really brutal police surveillance and violence that takes place routinely and is normalized in New York City. So profoundly, their experiences as undocumented people were shaped by this criminalization. And this is my last slide. So get your questions ready. There was an effect of all of this on employment. So we were interested in how, both how college students worked while they went to college, because that's like all CUNY students, the working class population, but also like their career paths and what they did after college. Obviously, the whole thing about being racialized is undocumented, and the association in people's mind, the stereotypes about what an undocumented person looks like is in employers' heads as well, right? And it's built into the structures of workplaces. So people definitely tell stories of contending with employers who either argued with them that, no, you are not undocumented, no, you don't have DACA because you're Asian or white, or they, the flip side, where someone may have already adjusted their status, but was still kind of questioned. But so that's kind of a more obvious way that way it works. But we also found that as with all jobs, most people get jobs through their networks, right? Not just by blindly answering an ad. Usually some kind of social networking is involved. And a lot of people got their jobs through their co-ethnic networks. So networks through their communities. And the inequalities between those communities shape the job opportunities. So, I have some of the examples of different groups in our interviews and the types of jobs that they had. So for instance, for college students, tutoring was a pretty decent job that paid well. And there was a huge local market in the Korean and Chinese communities for tutoring. So those students were able to take advantage of those opportunities. They were also time-wise flexible and accommodated a college schedule better than something like working at Target and not knowing your schedule until the week before. So one of the things that we looked at is how people with DACA and without DACA found their jobs and what those jobs were. And when people got DACA, definitely the job opportunities expanded. So a lot of them got new jobs through their college career service offices or internships that the college helped set up, and also just expanded beyond their co-ethnic communities. But for a lot of them, co-ethnic communities still continued to matter. In one interesting case, the Korean respondents told us that there is an online search kind of job board that actually marks where it's okay to not have status. So that eliminates the stress and anxiety of approaching jobs in a major way, right? For someone looking for opportunities. And some of those jobs were with transnational companies in these relatively wealthy immigrant communities where that you could have a job like an accountant after graduating from college, and so make pretty decent money. And then we found that some people continue to work for cash even with DACA because they were afraid to use their DACA. So some students that we talked to just continue to work for less than minimum wage in supermarkets or places like that out of fear. So I will stop there because I want to make sure to hear your questions and comments and any comparisons you want to make because I want to learn about where you are. I'm going to stop sharing.
Yeah, feel free. Thank you so much, Dr. Aptekar. That was a great presentation. And as you were talking, I found myself, a lot of similarities came to mind with things that have that on at UC Merced and in California in general. So yeah, anybody who has questions, please feel free to post your questions in the chat or unmute yourself to ask. This is the discussion time of our presentation.
Oh, go ahead, Meredith. Oh, yes, we've got hands. Good. I was going to jump in. I saw Meredith and then I saw Tyler. So.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Meredith. I'm an assistant professor in the sociology department. And I think this might be a bit tangential, but I was intrigued by what you found among the Chinese undocumented students, kind of relying less on sort of social movements or organizing, but more on these one-off asylum cases. And I wondered whether the changing terrain of asylum and refugee policy in the United States may be impacting that. I know your data are from 2017 to 2018, but I'd be interested to hear more about both the changing terrain of asylum and refugee policy and how you think that might impact some of these kind of strategies or lack of participation. And then also with COVID, the way that that's racializing particular groups, how that may impact some of the kind of affinities among undocumented students, if at all, given what we're seeing about how the pandemic is being also racialized in the rhetoric and also how it plays out, among the most sort of those who are kind of on the front lines already and essential or disposable or however you want to phrase it. If you could say a couple of words about that, that would be helpful.
Yeah, thank you. Those are such great questions. Amy Sin and I actually wrote a separate paper just on the Chinese respondents because it's so fascinating and really, really understudied. And so two things. One is the focus on kind of the relative lack of collective organizing, the focus of asylum, is also partly the result of very dire situation many migrants are in, because the average debt for being smuggled is $80,000, and there's just multi-year arrangements of paying that off, and they family separations that last decades, and so and there's also a tremendous amount of fraud and abuse in these services to these migrants, where they don't actually successfully get asylum because the rates are not that high. They're high for Chinese compared to other people, but they're not that high. And in terms of the difference, I mean, I think in some way, I think there will be, or is already, a push for kind of an expanded focus beyond asylum. But on the other hand, the way asylum policies are determined is not really based on who is in, whose life is in danger if they remain in the country. It's based on geopolitical interests of the United States, right? And China being, framed as a rival and enemy, we really need, I don't really see us changing the asylum policies that drastically for China specifically, because we need to be rescuing Chinese people from their oppressive government. We need to be able to show that to legitimate United States exceptionalism. So in that sense, there's that tension. And the COVID question is fascinating, and I want to think about it more. But kind of the attacks on Asian immigrants specifically with COVID, right, the Chinese virus, is a factor that could definitely push people into kind of more organizing and more coalition building, as well as the issue of, community students are exactly in those types of jobs that are the most dangerous for contracting the virus. They work in warehouses and in transit and in, all these public spaces. So I think that that's a factor for sure. Thanks. Thank you.
Tyler, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, I've got a question. Thanks for that talk. That was great. My name's Tyler. I'm an assistant prof in cognitive science. And I was wondering if your data spoke at all to ways in which faculty can stand in solidarity with DACA students and undocumented students, beyond the sort of, becoming involved with political advocacy and organizing work. Like, are there special things that we can do in virtue of our position that in your data came up as things that were helpful?
No, absolutely. Thanks for asking that, right? How do we use our positions as faculty? So there's a whole range, because we asked that, like, what would make it better, or easier, or more helpful for you on campus? So faculty members who signal to students in a syllabus or by saying something in class that they, supported immigrants or were open to talking without, putting any kind of pressure on disclosure, were appreciated. And then kind of follow up from class to class was appreciated. So when you had a professor last year and then DACA was almost rescinded and that professor emailed you and said, "Are you okay?" That went a long way. But another, so these are kind of interactional things that were appreciated by students. But faculty using their kind of institutional clout to fight for money is super important, right? To establish scholarships and find ways to do financial aid packages and just help materially is very important. And also faculty casting a critical eye on their programs and seeing how their programs may undermine the safety of their students. So one example was, a criminal justice department might be setting up internship with ICE for students. And maybe part of the job description for the internship is spying on your fellow students. Like, you should not be doing that, and you should be exposing things like that might be happening on your campus, because it puts the safety of these students at risk in a very concrete way. So those come to mind, but we actually, we have a list that I should have included in this presentation of from the perspective of students, what might be useful.
Thanks. And if you could send that list, I would love to see that.
Yeah.
That'd
Drop
be
your
great.
email in the
Oh, great. Thank you.
And Tyler, to add to that, so one of the things that I do, so I'm a PhD candidate in psychological sciences, but I work very closely with services for undocumented students on campus at UC Merced, and we run, I help co-facilitate the Undocu Scholars Academy, which is really aimed at teaching our undocumented students, professional development skills for grad school and things like that. And one of the things that we always get at least once every semester that we run these cohorts is that they always want to know, if we know of professors on campus who are friendly with undocumented students that are open to talking to them about their career interests. So we had people in Cog Sci that we were asking around like, do you know a professor who's friendly with undocumented students or open to speaking to them? So it's always helpful, Professor Aptekar mentioned, is including maybe something in the syllabus, because very few people do that, but the students who have seen that, it really opens a lot of networks, because then they share that with their friends, and sometimes it kind of relies on advocates at school to help point them in the direction of people that they know that they are open to having conversations with students who may be undocumented. And just having somebody to talk to is one of the biggest barriers that we always get, especially for those who are interested in graduate or professional school within fields, just knowing someone that they can approach to ask questions.
Yeah, that sounds like you have a great thing going there, Maria. Because my advice is more general, because I don't want to get too CUNY specific. But another thing that just came to mind, Maria was saying that is, we have had a number of students express frustration with faculty and staff who really out of the best intentions really try to fix things and kind of, why don't you try this, why don't you try this, why don't you try that? Because sometimes what students wanted is someone just to sit with the painful reality of where they were, and that they know not all of their dreams might be realized. So that's something to be aware of, and this kind of can be tricky to navigate to be a good ally.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
I'll jump in real quick. Professor Aptekar, thank you so much. I think so many light bulbs were going off, particularly in thinking of even the racialization of employment and possibilities on that. That was really eye-opening to me, because it kind of perpetuated a lot of the stereo and structural racist, right, institutions when you think about even the possibilities or what was opening. I was interested as a Caribbean, Black identifying Latina myself, right, who grew up very close to New York City. Julia's comment and recognition of Latinx as an ethnicity and not a race, but also kind of the intersectional globalization framework that you gave to, particularly Asian who grew up in Latin America, and that sort of historical migration. I'm looking to do a lot of racial equity and data work, particularly with the Latinx community and anti-Blackness within. Did that come up? How did that show up? I saw the Caribbean and the Trinidadian and things like that, and I'm thinking of, Dominicans and Cubans and all of that. Being fairly new to California, I will let my other experts on this. I know Dr. Zatz is on here and can speak to that, but are there plans to do a deeper dive and disaggregate that category so it's not limited by the federal constraints of it, particularly at this moment of where we are, right? Where valuing Black lives and who's included in that is really important.
No, absolutely. We relied on people's, the way they identified themselves, so not on census categories. So even the data that CUNY collects, people check the boxes, which are problematic. But the interviews that we did, we just asked people how they identified themselves. And unfortunately, it's a shortcoming of the study. We do not have that many Cubans and Dominicans who are Black identified. And so it is, something, COVID happened, so the study had to be cut off. But if, and there are, serious safety concerns with interviewing people on Zoom for this study. So, but it's something I would definitely want to explore more, because it's a crucial question. right? So the Black respondents that we have are from Jamaica, from Trinidad, and from Africa.
Perfect.
Not the Spanish.
Well, I look forward to that follow-up proposal on the Grant Foundation doing so. Go ahead, Dr. Zach.
You're muted.
I'd just add to that, and this didn't get into race as much as nationality and ethnicity, but Tom Wong's earlier work on who was applying for DACA, who got DACA, was looking very much at differences by ethnicity and nationality. But he was really focusing there on what kind of community support there was. And so where you had immigrant communities that were pretty well established, and so you had organizations that were working and where there was more media attention. And so he was seeing, for instance, that the Korean immigrants were doing much better at getting DACA than some other Asian immigrants, and attributed that to some of the work of the community organizations and media. So it wasn't getting at race in quite the way that you're looking at it, that you're suggesting it, but it was breaking out the undocumented population in some ways and seeing who's being more successful in it, and why, what's counting for that. So that might be something as a starting point for some future work.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. But I wonder what people think about defining applying for DACA as a success. Because, some of our respondents said that they regret doing it because now the government has their data and look at what happened.
Yeah. It was different when, under Obama, it felt like there was a chance for things getting better and better than where we are now. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. This is our post-Trump research. That's what we found.
Yeah.
If I could just ask, piggyback on that, because you mentioned that at the very beginning that you were going to talk about what it was like methodologically to have to kind of switch right away to the post-Obama, early days of the Trump administration. I'd love to hear more about your experience with that, if there's time.
Yeah, sure. So quickly, we had planned to actually send out recruitment letters to all undocumented CUNY students because we had all their addresses, not personally, but through intermediaries. And then the election happened. We're like, I'm not doing that anymore.
I know, yeah.
And so we went with total opt-in through flyer recruitment. Is compromising kind of what would have been a representative sample maybe, but whatever, that does not matter. It was really unsafe to do it that way, and we wanted no part with it. And actually, we were very concerned with the institution even having that data in the first place and what it was doing with it. Yeah, so we removed that whole aspect from our study.
I think we have time for one more question. Go ahead, Tyler.
No, I've already asked one. So if someone else has a question, then they should.
I was going to squeeze one in. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Aptekar, for your presentation. I wanted to talk a little bit about the the racialization, and specifically for folks who are quote unquote passing, right? And how that shaped their experiences, and specifically thinking about identity formation. And speaking from my own example, I'm Middle Eastern, and a lot of my relatives were undocumented, and there was this sense in the family of, don't talk about this relative in public because, they're a secret almost, or folks who had a different name than what was on their documentation and things like that. So I'm curious about, for folks who are quote unquote passing, what were some of those conversations like within the family, if there were any, and how did that affect that identity formation that then took place?
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That's such a great point. Definitely, because I did mention this, but we interviewed a lot of siblings on purpose. So we had a good sense of some of the family dynamics. And you're pointing out to the trend that we did see with people who are quote unquote pass more as documented, having kind of a more intense focus within the family on secrecy, but also kind of thinking that their case was unique or rare. and unable to connect their story to the larger story, which for their, really did shape how they understood themselves as young people. And kind of, in strategic decisions about who to hang out with in order to pass, like Joseph, right? To not seem too fresh off the boat, as he said. And how like the performativity of their self to the outside world, I would say definitely played a role.
We have time, Tyler. If you want, go ahead, take us home.
I was going to ask if you could share your feelings on that data issue. The fact that you have all that data. I don't know if the UC system has that data. Maybe Danya, you could speak to that. Yeah, how do we think about this tension between wanting to have services targeted to the students that we know need them, and might not be willing or might not have the ability and resources to seek them out themselves, versus really being open to a kind of exploitation by the government?
Right. Yeah. Personally, I don't want the institution to have this data, and I think there are many other ways the staff could do more and faculty could do more to do successful outreach and reach more students, and to respect the decision of many students to not disclose, which is a very valid decision. The institution before the election made this data available to like a regular advisor that was like a check thing in your student records. Yes. And we also investigated what happened after that was removed. So very quickly when Trump was elected, they revamped the system. They removed all of that. It's only accessible to the very highest administrators. And staff, because they want to help students and because they're under so much pressure to produce results and to document the number of students they helped and connected to scholarships, made their own lists. And they made these lists that they kept like an Excel spreadsheet on their desktop. So I think that always happens anyway, right? Because of the institutional pressure and the austerity of our university systems. So it can get complicated, right? So it's not just this other data that CUNY has, it's like the data that staff produce.
Yeah, I know we're at time, but Marjorie, I actually don't know, Tyler, about the list. So maybe they're so secretly protected that I don't even have access to them. But Marjorie, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I still had my hand up.
No, I was going to say, do you know if we...
I know what I always did in grad, which is we never had any kind of published list,
right,
anything on email or anything like that. But I also, it was a small enough group that I knew who we were talking about and could make sure that if there was something they were eligible for, that information got to them. But I never wanted anything in writing anywhere that could be a public document.
Perfect. Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Professor Aptekar, for agreeing to share your list with us and your resources. Thank you, everyone, for coming and for being in community with us on this important topic. And we'll see you.
This is great. Thank you.
No, thanks
so much for having me.
Of course. Come virtually visit us anytime.
I will.
We're happy to visit you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.